Okay, so now for something completely different. In 1995, Charles Roy published his PhD dissertation on a study called Living and Serving Persons with HIV in the Canadian AIDS Movement. And this was the first systematic research study worldwide that we know of around the involvement of people living with HIV in the HIV response and the HIV movement. Since then, Canada's become a leader in helping to articulate the GPA principle, greater involvement of people living with HIV. And no one better to speak at the Charles Roy Memorial Lecture on community-based research than Kathy Worthington. She's associate professor in social policy and public health at University of Victoria. After training initially as a social worker like Charles and doing her PhD in HIV-related issues, she moved to Calgary, and she's done been involved in numerous studies around homeless youth, involvement in research, people living with HIV, prevention among vulnerable communities, testing and counseling, and many, many other topics, and always with a keen attention to the role of people living with and at risk for HIV. So please, let's welcome Kathy Worthington.
Well, I feel like Evan just gave my talk for me. So, as you'll hear in a moment when I start, I've structured this as a letter to Charles. Do I have my slides up? Yes? Yes. Dear Charles, we met in 1995 when you were completing your doctorate in social work and I was just starting mine. You were very warm and so supportive to the person I was then, a newbie to the social work research world and to the AIDS community movement. And we bonded over data sets and angst over PhD programs and PhD completion. I remember visiting you when you had almost finished your thesis, the document that was to become Living and Serving Persons with HIV in the Canadian AIDS Movement. Your partner, Alan, who was also living with HIV, was frail and on oxygen and just a few months from the end of his life. I remember having one of those rich talks about life, death, and meaning-making that can only happen when death is not abstract, but an ever-present reality, a certainty. That certainly was what the AIDS movement felt like then, with HIV taking the lives of young, vibrant men and women. AIDS then truly was a battle of and for a lifetime, as you said. You've been gone for over 10 years now, but I still think about you from time to time. You had such a warmth and welcoming presence, and I know you supported many others the way you supported me. I've especially been thinking of you over the last month or so while I've been trying to figure out what to say in this talk. This is a space within the OHTN conference to honor you and your legacy. Because you've been in my thoughts, my talk turned into this letter to you. As I think about what community-based research, or CBR for short, was, is, and what the upcoming generation of HIV researchers and community members might and will make it. As a researcher, I've been privileged to work with community in all its complexities in and through community-based research. Community-based research has grown into its own enterprise and has different meanings, shapes, and shades. But at its heart, CBR is still about the principles of greater and meaningful involvement of people living with HIV/AIDS, GPA-MIPA, that you promoted. And so, in this letter to you, I want to reflect on what I've learned from working in different regions of Canada and at the national level on committees and centres that support HIV research, like REACH, SRC, the CTN, and as we provide mentoring to a new generation of amazing CBR researchers through the Universities Without Walls, or UWW, training program. I'm not claiming to say anything new, but rather to provide a few brief reflections from my own experience. This is not a story about the good old days, nor is it a narrative about the marvels of progress. I would like to simply reflect on the complexities of the different eras and some of the things we've done. Hopefully, some of the history of HIV-CBR will be helpful for the younger generation, and some of the ideas and experiences of our up-and-coming CBR generation will provide some food for thought for those of us who've been around for a while. Themes: then, now, next. Contexts: then. Well, Charles, I don't need to tell you that in 1995, we were in the middle of a public health HIV predicament. The HIV community worked with a sense of urgency and force. In Canada, there was a relatively small group of people in each province, clinicians, public health folks, community services, academics, working and bickering and fighting together on treatment and a public health agenda within a policy context that was supported by a national AIDS strategy and the national community and research partners. The discourse analysis folks call it a period of AIDS exceptionalism. With this framing dominant, it meant that the HIV community could advocate for resources because of the exceptional threat to public health, and also argue against traditional public health measures like quarantine because of the exceptional social and political circumstances. AIDS service organizations were now, or were becoming with some tension, service agencies trying to serve more diverse communities in a more professional model. In universities, it was a time of public health theory and model innovation, at least to my younger eyes, in terms of the health promotion population health models that were being developed and the foundations of what would become a social determinants of health approach. As well, participatory and qualitative research methods and models were being hotly debated and feuded over, and community-based research was one form that was embraced within the public health community. GEPA was declared at the Paris Conference in '94, and Health Canada's National Health Research and Development Program provided support to community research through the HIV/AIDS community-based research program. Now, things have certainly changed, Charles. Of course, since 1996, we've had effective HIV medication to control the disease, and there is even talk of a cure. But right now, it's an epidemic that is still with us. It is still concentrated in our priority populations and not going away anytime soon. ASOs have continued to develop programs to serve clients within a professional model and to advocate in the ways that they may. But several recent national surveys show HIV is a less urgent issue in the public mind. AIDS isn't exceptional anymore. There is a move to combine and integrate HIV programs and funding within sexually transmitted infection and bloodborne infection funding envelopes at the national level and within some provinces. The discourse analysis folks say we're in an era of new public administration, where the HIV community and all other service areas must provide evidence of effectiveness and efficiency in order to obtain resources. Of course, within this type of framework, evidence-informed approaches are heavily promoted. But within this framework, there is still room for participatory evaluation approaches that are closely aligned with CBR. As well, within public health research more broadly, there is less and less satisfaction with the traditional experiment or randomized controlled trial as the best way to understand whether or not single programs or interventions as the best that are nested within complex networks of community services and whether they've been effective at achieving the things they want to achieve. So, there is a push to do more at the population health or community level, and also an opportunity to use participatory evaluation approaches to get community voices heard within this administrative framing. Next, the question that we've been asking ourselves over dinners and glasses of wine over the last while is, with the end of AIDS exceptionalism, how do we move forward with the integration of HIV into sexual health and drug use services, if we must, in a way that respects and honors our histories, preserves and transmits what we've learned from HIV to other service areas, and still accounts for some of the uniqueness of HIV? We ask these questions as CBR researchers too. When we have conversations with our young HIV researchers in the Universities Without Walls program, what do we advise pragmatically? To be and HIV researchers, gay men's health and HIV, Indigenous methodologies and HIV, blended and interdisciplinary and professional identities that we have always had, but for academic and research positions, it now feels like you need more than HIV on your CV. HIV isn't enough. Things are different, Charles. CBR as practice. Then, of course, Charles, community-based research has been around for a while, and it has always been difficult in the HIV world to disentangle the researchers from the community. Many have always been both, but they somehow lose their community membership when they wear a researcher hat or get a research degree. CBR has a long history with roots in critical emancipatory movements and adult education, as well as pragmatic action research. But as I mentioned before, things in the mid to late 90s and early years of the new millennium were percolating in terms of alternative research approaches. We were reading books on participatory research, feminist research, the first volumes on Indigenous research, and as well, public health researchers in the US were beginning to popularize community-based participatory research in health. The Wellesley Institute and the OHTN started supporting and promoting CBR, and we had people like Sarah Flicker and Rob Travers who worked in dedicated positions to develop CBR and foster a sense of community around community-based research and HIV, and who also did, and still do, a lot of work analyzing the issues and challenges with CBR. People in other regions, like Terry Tressler and Rick Marchand in BC, were also having an impact. The tensions and contradictions of CBR make it and made it an always engaging and sometimes exhausting type of research to conduct. It is a set of principles brought to research done by community and with community rather than one method. The principles, as I'm sure you all know, include shared power decision-making and research resources, a commitment to building relationships and working collaboratively through the entire research process, a commitment to local, context-based issues and questions, capacity building, and to doing something with the research results that benefit community. CBR doesn't dictate a particular study type or study tools. From a researcher perspective, doing CBR requires an ability to shut up, listen, and learn, and to be willing to be a resource for how the research work is done, rather than an advocate for what research is done. I think every CBR team, and from our discussions with the UWW fellows, maybe every generation, rediscovers for themselves the tensions inherent in CBR. Who exactly is community? Can agencies be community? If they aren't, then which elements of community are at the table and who's excluded? What about being an insider, outsider, or community member researcher? Where do they fit? What about equity in relationships? Why are some people always more equal than others? What about tension between research and advocacy? What about the tensions between individual level and community level ethics of CBR? And maybe most fundamentally, is it outsider research, prioritizing individual empowerment and social change, or establishment research about effective and efficient services, or both? Well, Charles, as you know, in the late 90s, early years of the new millennium, we certainly felt like we were outsiders. From the researcher perspective, in the many spaces, but not mine, thank goodness, CBR was considered not to be as rigorous as real research. And many people had difficulty with their academic job security because CBR work tends to be slower than traditional research, and therefore your academic output is also slower or perhaps less. It was not easy to get funding to do this type of research. We also had to learn by doing. Sometimes either the academic partner or the community partner would default to the older doing it on contract type of relationship, where the community said what the issue was and the academic went away and did the work. But we learned, sometimes from our mistakes. We learned that power was always present, academic community and community, but that if we developed terms of reference so that we had clear roles, decision-making lines, community ownership and authorship rights, at least we had a structure to work from that people agreed upon. We learned how to build a budget so that community agency and community participants were compensated equitably for their time. We learned to start small, develop relationships and trust, and not to be afraid of conflict as long as the group handled it respectfully. We learned to be self-reflexive and have a sense of humor. At this point, in the late 90s, early 2000s, the community-based research facilitators were in place as part of the NHRDP Health Canada CBR funding, and they were there to work with the CBR teams. My own first work as an independent CBR researcher in Alberta certainly would have been much more full of errors without them, and in particular San, who worked as the Alberta CBRF. Charles, when I knew you, you were a Toronto person. But what I learned as I moved across the country was that HIV CBR is intensely context dependent. It is time, community, and service and community epidemic specific. Calgary's HIV community is very different than Victoria's, which is different than Vancouver's, which is different than Toronto's. Just like the culture, political context, and geography and history of every region and city is different. But the CBR principles are flexible and can take those elements into account. When I arrived in Calgary in 2000, I was welcomed by community and by medical service providers and ASOs as someone with social science research skills that were new to that HIV community. As a newly minted academic and researcher, I was naturally humble and wanting to help with whatever HIV CBR projects community wanted to do. Then, there were no expectations about what CBR should be beyond the principles of CBR. Paramount were the usefulness of the results for community agencies and also the engagement of community agencies and community members at every step of the project. We dove into CBR somewhat naively together, but with solid foundations and support, and produced good work on a few studies that influenced services policies and changed the career paths and the research nerd status of several community partner members. Now, 10 years later, in 2011, when I arrived as a new academic to BC, I found a very different CBR context. Community was cautiously welcoming because I came with good CBR street cred, but there was a much longer track record of HIV social research now in many regions, and particularly in BC, where some strong social HIV research had been conducted, some of it CBR, some of it not. And so the HIV community had a set of assumptions about how things would unfold, the role I would take as an academic, the role that peer researchers would take on, and what research methods would be used. When I was invited to work on a study with the Pacific AIDS Network, there was considerable unlearning on all sides of the table within our team and the team-building process that had to be done before we could really move forward. And this is true of every new project we start, because every project is different. Over the past 10 years, Charles, CBR has continued to grow in prominence, visibility, and acceptability as the new public administration has embraced CBR as a method that provides integrated knowledge translation, or direct use in services, programs, and policy. With the restructuring of the CIHR CBR programs to eliminate the community-based research facilitator positions and instead to fund two national centers, the REACH CBR Collaborative and the AHA Center for Capacity Building in Aboriginal HIV CBR, we've certainly turned into more of a national network of networks, as it were. About a year ago at a team meeting, I found myself making a truly felt but lame-sounding social work comment about how we had developed into a CBR community across the country. I can go to any city and will know at least one person, community or academic, who can connect me to the HIV CBR and the related work going on in that community. This increased ability to network and support each other is a direct result of the new structures that were funded 5-ish years ago to support collaboration. That's REACH, the SRC, and now the CBR centers. From an individual researcher or community member perspective, these centers are a wonderful resource. But then I'm biased as I belong to them and obviously like being part of networks. But as we get larger, there's a tendency to move to a form of institutionalization of CBR, and maybe even a cookbook approach if we aren't careful, rather than letting each project be unique and unfold using the principles of CBR. We also need to guard against having the national collaboratives become a closed club. The whole point of them is to foster innovative research and build capacity and mentor new HIV researchers and bring researchers new to HIV into the CBR world, not to hold on to the resources for those already here. Next. Charles, I know you were passionate about community having a strong presence in HIV work and HIV research. As I mentioned before, there have always been community members who've been leaders in HIV CBR research, but there's a coming shift. Those who in the past were key community partners and community principal investigators will soon be independent, in other words, with their own PhDs, and perhaps academic researchers. The next generation of HIV researchers working with communities in more communities will be community leaders themselves. And this will take methods forward into approaches that suit their communities and cultures, into Indigenous, decolonizing, and African diaspora methodologies. That's something to celebrate. There is also another side to the next of CBR. Now that CBR has been around for a while, has gained prominence and national infrastructure, some see CBR as establishment research. This is a view of some of the UWW fellows, who ask honest and welcome questions about the way they perceive CBR and the CBR structures. And it's not a sentiment only expressed by UWW fellows. I've heard from others that it can feel like CBR is the only or approved way of accessing funds for critical social science and health services HIV work, which admittedly is a pretty small slice of the Canadian HIV research. As CBR has become more prominent, has it become institutionalized? UWW fellows and others ask good questions like, what about individual research? What about research that is critical of community? Where is this kind of reflection? And what about engaging in HIV research with those who don't identify with the HIV community at all? By providing resources to HIV CBR, we don't want to stifle other forms of HIV social research. Outcomes. Charles, within the framing of the new public administration, I wanted to end with one final idea that I think we need to attend to in order to guarantee the sustainability of HIV CBR, assuming that's what the HIV community desires. This has to do with examining the outcomes of HIV CBR, not only for one study, but for CBR as a research orientation. But first, some history. Then, importantly for the existence of a national HIV CBR funding program, the HIV CBR program that I mentioned earlier that had been part of NHRDP was eventually transferred to CIHR in 2004. The HIV/AIDS CBR program within CIHR is a bit of an anomaly. Because it was inherited from the old NHRDP as part of the National Strategy funding package, it had some challenges for CIHR to administer, but also created some innovation in their practices. Very few other operating grant pots of money allow community agencies, rather than universities or hospitals, to hold the funds. And having worked with 3 community agencies to get the authorization to hold CIHR funds, I can tell you it's no process picnic. And CBR also challenged CIHR to allow some costs, like the salary buyouts for research time of community co-investigators and community principal investigators, that are not allowed under most funding streams. Even things like rent for office space, which is a no-brainer as an allowable expense for community, meant a change in the CIHR rules. So the fact that we have a small national fund to support this type of CBR research within the CIHA structure is in itself a bit of a miracle. I wanted to look back to see what work we did as a CBR community in the late 90s and early 2000s. At a national level, I thought the NHRDP CBR funding list might give me some clues, but I couldn't find those lists. So with thanks to Jennifer and Suzette at CIHR, I did get a list of the CBR operating grants funded by CIHR from the time the program was administered by them, starting in about 2004-2005. While these only give a partial picture at any time, as there's lots of CBR work that is funded locally, provincially, or just done off the side of people's desks, and there's also CBR work that is funded but not called CBR, this at least gives a sense of the types of work we were doing at different points in time and where it was being done. In 2005, the first year when there were full records, there were 4 general stream operating grants funded. 1 with the PI located in BC, 1 with the principal investigator in Quebec, and 2 with the principal investigators in Ontario. 1 Aboriginal stream operating grant was funded and held nationally at CAN, the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network. 3 of these studies were mixed method studies, mixing surveys with qualitative interviews, looking at service needs. 1 was an intervention study, and 1 study was on service development. If we jump ahead to 2012, the numbers look similar. 1 in BC, 1 in Quebec, 2 in Ontario, 1 Aboriginal stream grant held by CAN, and 1 other held in Alberta. But the types of CBR research have shifted a bit. Now, where there were 2 best practices or intervention studies, 2 on policy and service systems discourses, 1 strategy formulation, and 1 using Indigenous methods. The shift has been away from needs identification and community description and services development to an examination of policies and interventions. This makes sense, given that we needed descriptive work earlier in the epidemic, but it also shows our shift to bigger CBR, with a desire to directly influence policy and service systems rather than single services or programs. Over the entire CIHR HIV/AIDS CBR program, from 04-05 to last year's announcements in 2012, there have been 68 operating grants funded in total, 48 in the general stream and 20 in the Aboriginal stream. Of these in the general stream, just over half have gone to Alberta-based PIs, 26. 7 went to BC, and 7 to Quebec-based PIs, and 3 went to Alberta-based PIs. The Atlantic had 2, Saskatchewan and Manitoba had 1 each, and for 1, the PI was unknown. Now, of course, we need to be really careful about the conclusions we draw because there are other funding sources, some studies are multi-regional, but it looks like Ontario had the highest level of HIV CBR work being conducted as measured by where the PI was. And of the other provinces, at least according to HIV prevalence, it looks like BC and Quebec are not receiving their fair proportion of the funds. But of course, through much of this time, there were provincial funding streams and structures to support their work. And this is a pretty small program, funding about 4 general stream and 2 Aboriginal stream operating grants per year. So that's a quick overview of what we've done. What about outcomes? As CBR researchers, we tend to be very reflexive and attentive to process issues. CBR studies incorporate knowledge translation, or research findings use, directly into their study processes, developing community products or policy notes or briefing papers during the study. And the CBR literature claims that CBR benefits local community through empowerment, capacity building, policy and practice change, among other things. Anecdotally, that is, from what we report about good CBR studies, and from informally tracking results from the studies we do have some evidence that CBR studies can create positive outcomes. But within a framing of the new public administration, is this good enough? Can we do better at demonstrating the effective outcomes of CBR? And here, Charles, I have to admit that while teams I have been on have built in process evaluations into most CBR studies, I've done an outcome evaluation on only one of the CBR studies I was part of, and even that only went into the project report, not a publication. But I looked to the literature to see what I could find about the evaluation of CBR outcomes, and found one recent study that attempted to synthesize the information that is out there on how to evaluate CBR, and what those tools looked like. What this group of American researchers found was that most of the evaluations they found in the literature spanning the years 2002 to 2008 focused on, guess what? The process elements of CBR. Things like relational dynamics, structures, like formal agreements and power sharing resources, and individual dynamics. What's the community reputation of the academic PI? What are the core values of the group? There was much less on outcomes of CBR. There were some measures that assessed community member empowerment outcomes, about 10% of the measures, while under 5% measured changes in policies and practice, and less than 1% looked at health outcomes. So, if we are to support and sustain HIV CBR and CBR more generally, we could start to be more planful and conscious about building in time and resources to assess the outcomes of our CBR work within this world of accountability and administration. Conclusion. So, Charles, I hope what I have said would leave you feeling like we've done good work over the past couple of decades. CBR will continue to promote and engage with community in new and different forms. Is CBR what it was then? At its core, yes. But in its structure and focus, we have responded to our contexts. As a set of principles, not a set method, it will continue to inform the research that is done by and with community. In tribute and with much respect, Kathy.